Well, President Trump back in office, and we've already seen a lot of movement in the first month or so since he's been in the White House. But what about taxes? A lot of people are curious about what tax rates will be looking like as we move forward. We've seen a little bit of an inkling into what those proposals might look like. We're going to dive into it all coming up with John next. Welcome in. Glad to have you. I'm Ben George with John Stillman at Rosewood Wealth Management. And John, President Trump back in office. It's been a quiet few weeks, hasn't it, for him since he's taken back over?
Moving hard and fast. Yes.
Break stuff, fix stuff, whatever. But I know taxes are a big part of this. And, leading up to this election, we were talking a lot about what tax rates could look like depending on who got elected. So now we know who's in office. Is there a little more clarity? I kind of want to talk about that with you today, because I think that's one of the biggest things on everybody's radar right now with the tax rate sunsetting here coming up pretty soon.
Yeah. So to try to understand where we might be going with taxes, we really need to understand where we've been, right? So for many, many years before leading up to Trump's first term, we had essentially the same tax code and similar tax rates for a very long time. We hadn't had any major changes to the tax code. So Trump gets elected 2016, takes office in 2017, and then they spent that first year of his first term, 2017, working on a new tax code. He had a Republican Congress at the time, and so they were working together on this. It took all of 2017. Like, I remember Christmas Eve of 2017, you had Mike Lee and Marco Rubio, and they're arguing for a larger child tax credit, like right at the end of the year. And so they finally get this tax bill passed, and it goes into effect at the beginning of 2018. So that's what gave us the tax code that we have now, which notably included a few things. One, it was a reduction in the tax rates. So you had the tax brackets before. It was like the 15% bracket and the 25% bracket and the 28% bracket. And of course, depending on where your income is, that determines what bracket you fall in. Well, they cut all those rates. So the 15% bracket became the 12% bracket. The 25 became the 22. The 28% bracket became the 24%. So it was an across the board rate cut all the way up. The other thing they did that was significant was they increased the standard deduction. And so the way that works, if you're not familiar, you can take the standard deduction or you can itemize your deductions. So if you say, all right, well, I pay mortgage interest and I give money to my church and I have state and local property taxes, I can deduct all those from my taxes. I'm going to itemize. Well, they make it easy so that for people who don't have a lot of deductions, they just say, well, you can take the standard deduction, which before 2017, before 2018, the new law came in, the standard deduction was like, $6,000 or $7,000 per person. So for a married couple, it might be $13,000 that you could take as the standard deduction. Well, with the new tax code, the standard deduction became like $15,000 per person or $30,000 for a couple. So now you have a lot fewer people itemizing their deductions and a lot more people just taking the standard deduction. So you were able to deduct more of your income and the rates were lower, which is why it amounted to a tax cut for almost everybody. And so realistically, if you like low taxes, and who doesn't, I think really what you should be rooting for is not necessarily a tax cut from where we are now, because I just don't know how realistic that is. We're at a pretty low tax rate now, historically speaking. What you really should be rooting for is an extension of what we currently have. Because when they put this bill in place, it was called the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, if you remember that. It was set to expire at the end of 2025. So if Congress did nothing at all this year, we would go back to the tax rates that we had before Trump's first term. So the 12% bracket would go back up to 15%. The 22 would go back up to the 25. That's if Congress does nothing. We would revert to the old rates in 2026. Realistically, with now a Republican trifecta, even though it's a very slight trifecta in the House, realistically, you can probably expect that they're going to pass an extension of the current tax code that looks pretty similar to what we have with maybe a few changes. But it's funny because for the first couple of years of it, people acted like it was only a tax cut for high income people, which was not the case at all. I mean, virtually all of our clients at all income levels got a tax cut from this. And of course, the media famously, the New York Times, actually, I remember they had a headline in like late 2019. And the headline was basically, "Time to face facts. You probably did get a tax cut." And so it was like them admitting, okay, we didn't want to give this administration any credit for cutting taxes. But the reality is, if you just look at the math, yeah, most people did get a tax cut. And so, like I said, you're probably rooting for an extension of the current code more so than wild changes that are going to really reduce it further. That's probably not realistic because almost everybody got a tax cut before.
So, John, if rates were lowered across the board, why did that not amount to a tax cut for everybody?
Yeah, well, so it makes sense, right? If all the rates are lowered and the standard deduction is higher, why was it not a tax cut for everybody? It's a great question. The reason is because of something called the SALT cap.
Okay.
SALT is an acronym. It stands for state and local taxes. And so it used to be that you could deduct, if you were itemizing your deductions, you could deduct all of your state and local taxes. Well, with this current tax code, they capped the amount that you could deduct at $10,000. So who does that affect? Well, that affects high income people. If you have a high income, you're paying a lot in state income taxes. Now you can't necessarily deduct all of it. If you're living in a place where property values are high and property tax rates are high, you might have a big property tax bill and you can't deduct all of it. So think about the people that this would most affect. A lot of it is people in big cities, blue states. Like if you're living in LA and you're making $300,000 or $400,000 a year and you're paying California state income taxes, and you have a $2 million home that you might be paying $20,000+ a year in property taxes on. Well, now you suddenly can't deduct all that. So even the rate decreased for everybody because they're now able to take fewer deductions on their taxes. It was actually a rate or a tax increase for a lot of high income people and a lot of people in blue states, frankly. So it was looked at as almost like a punishment for living in a blue state where property taxes are high, state income tax rates are high. And so now you have this interesting dynamic. There's this guy named Mike Lawler, if you know who he is. He's a Republican from the state of New York, Republican congressman. He was elected at the midterms back in 2022, and he's now sort of the poster child for wanting to get rid of the SALT cap because he's in a blue state, but he's a Republican. He's kind of the guy who can have Trump's ear to say, all right, well, let's help out the people who are, paying these higher property taxes, paying these higher state taxes. Let's get rid of the SALT cap. So if that happens, it's not going to have any adverse effect on people who are, at the lower income rates or the lower property values, but it would then be a tax cut for people over that rate. So yeah. That's really the thing to watch. If there's going to be any kind of significant change, it's probably going to be on that front with the SALT cap. Okay.
So maybe the SALT cap, and that's not going to affect obviously a high percentage of the population. But other than that, then I guess not really looking to expect to see any major changes then from Trump's taxes then.
Yeah, I think maybe some slight changes, but I just don't predict anything that's going to be a major sweeping, massive change to the tax code like what we saw. We just got that. And it's not that often that we have sweeping changes to the tax code. And to have just had it, 7 years ago, probably not likely, especially when you consider that it's essentially the same administration, the same Congress that did it before. Probably not going to be any wild changes.
So all these extreme ideas we might see, like no federal income tax across the board, these things are probably a lot of the time just negotiation tactics for what he's trying to accomplish, probably.
Yeah, it'd be great. Sounds great on paper. It's not going to happen.
Yeah. Well, that's too bad. Well, good stuff, John. I know something we'll be watching and monitoring over the next, next 10 or 12 months until we get to the end of 2025 and kind of see where we are moving forward. But again, if you have questions for John, we'd love to hear from you. 800-545-2991. John, thanks as always. Appreciate it. And please hit subscribe wherever you're watching. We appreciate your support as well. Talk to you again next video.
Carolina Wealth Stewards, doing business as Rosewood Wealth Management, is a registered investment advisor in the state of North Carolina. The material presented is intended to be general information and should not be construed by any consumer as the rendering of personalized investment advice.